The country descends into arguments as people disagree whether the lockdown rules are too harsh or too slack. One man, caught making a 120-mile round trip from Nottingham to London, said, "Come on, I'm just trying to buy some bread. It's £1 cheaper in London after all. In these tough economic times, if that's not essential travel, I don't know what is." A police spokeswoman said in response, based on his comments, that a drugs test might be a good idea. In other news, a Gosport resident complained to the council saying, "Can you believe it? I looked out of my window and saw someone walking past my house. Has the world gone mad? Can't we scoop all these people up and put them in a campsite somewhere to increase social distancing?" As punishment, they could be forced to listen to Radio 1. A town councillor reminded her that it is legal to leave your house for 4 reasons and dismissed the suggestion on the grounds that a campsite of rule breakers listening to Radio 1 sounds terrifyingly close to Glastonbury Festival, and this country is suffering enough as it is. My name's Andy, that's all fake news, and you're watching Alverstoke Antiviral. Well, welcome to Alverstoke Antiviral, a dose of spiritual sanity from the Bible. And today we're going to be looking at Leviticus and what it shows us about, well, it prepares us for Easter by showing us about the problem of humanity. And I'm joined here with Colin. Hello, Colin.
Hi there, Andy.
Hi. Are you looking forward to Leviticus?
Well, it's not my favourite book, but there's some good stuff in it nevertheless.
The goal of today is to make it your favourite book of the Bible. So we'll see how that goes.
Boy, that's a big ask.
Well,
or expectation.
Yeah. But right now we're going to go to an interview with Sally Stringer. Sally, a member of our church who I caught up with earlier and had an uproarious conversation with, which was a lot more amusing than I expected it to be, actually. She does drift slightly to one side of her camera throughout this interview, so bear with that. But it's just so good. I just thought we can't redo this. We can't, try and replicate this in real time. So here is our interview with Sally. Well, Sally, hello. It's good to see you.
Hello. Hello.
We've had some fun trying to get this all connected, but we've done it in the end, thanks to technology. How are you getting on with the quarantine and the self-isolation? How are you keeping busy and managing it all?
Well, I haven't found it very easy to have to stay in and not be able to go for exercise and to meet people. I've missed seeing people's faces, but hey, I can see your face now.
And aren't we all better for that? Yes. So I heard you've been doing some remote meetings and things like that.
Well, I've used the Zoom for Weight Watchers. The usual time that I go to the Weight Watchers group, I've been using Zoom, and I've been able to get on Life Group, which I found very beneficial and really great to have fellowship, especially the prayer time when we had praying the whole church together and yet separately. I found that very powerful. I've also learned a lot about other media. Dear me, I don't think I've ever chatted so much on social media. I've used Facebook much more. I've used Facebook Messenger, which I found really good with the video as well, which we are using now. I'm using, I found a program called Angel, which is for oldies, vintage. It's you find it near BBC Two, and it's beaming from heaven. And there are some Christian programs on there.
Oh.
Your thought for the day and things like that, and they seem to be very helpful. The little that I've seen of them, that is. And I've been trying to exercise with NHS exercises online, and even doing it to a bit of jazz. You ought to see me doing that.
Good grief, Sally.
Yeah.
Living the high life.
I've been coffee time, I've been looking, sitting by my window, open window, and watching to see what my neighbours are doing.
Oh no, you're one of those people. You're one of those people who spies on their neighbours. Have you
I've been
called
watching
anyone?
them gardening and painting their fences and letting their dogs out, lounging in their garden for coffee time. Oh, it's great.
Oh, do you want to just move slightly more centrally? Because to your camera, the other way. Yes. So that's brilliant. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, because otherwise I'm not coming up. Oh yeah, so you're able to watch the world go by and see people garden and things like that from your high flat.
Yeah, second floor. I'm also been watching on a certain channel on my TV. I can look at Stoke Road and see what's going on there as well.
Can you?
Yeah, so that's pretty amazing, isn't it?
What's that
so
called?
If you cycle by, I'll be able to see you.
Oh dear. Have you ordered a telescope so you can spy on the... You haven't chopped anyone to the police for breaking...
No.
quarantine?
Well, I had a rather amazing experience the other day. I was charging my digital radio, which is very loud because I dropped it in the the toilet one day, dried it out, but now the volume won't go down.
Oh my word.
Anyway, yes, but anyway, I was charging it and trying to get hold of, I think it's UCB Christian Radio, but didn't think I'd managed to get it, and as far as I knew, I turned it off and it was all quiet, and then suddenly, boomed a voice out of the radio, and it said, "I will never leave you or nor forsake you," and then it turned off again.
Oh my word.
So that was a bit extraordinary.
It's good to know that God is using broken radios to speak and encourage people with the truth in the Bible. Oh wow.
Quite, yeah. Quite.
Now Sally,
he did it quite fantastically that time.
Sally, I was going to ask you a bit about some of your experience in the 1950s, because this is not the first epidemic or pandemic you've had to deal with, and obviously you've worked in nursing and in medical care in your life. So do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yes, I can tell you a little bit. I think it was probably 1957. I was still doing my student nurse training in Hampstead General Hospital, Northwest 3. And during that time, there was the Asian flu, which was really bad at that time. And we were told as nurses, even if we had a slight temperature, we had to go off duty immediately. And I did have a slight temperature, so I had to go home to Hampshire for 2 weeks. And I wasn't particularly well during that time. In the hospital, one person was paralysed because of it, and another had it in her brain, so it was pretty awful. Yeah, it was pretty ghastly.
Right.
But we didn't have all the measures that go on now to protect people.
No, there's protective personal equipment, isn't there? PPE and all sorts of stuff. But I suppose the basic principles of these illnesses are the same, and some of the symptoms would be the same.
Well, it was like a flu, of course, but it was much worse. You know, no, absolutely no energy, absolutely flattened.
So you got it yourself?
I did indeed. I had to be off duty for 2 weeks, yes.
Oh dear, oh dear. And what was it like?
What survived?
Well, yes, clearly you're here to tell the tale. Yes, and what was it like working in a hospital at that time, and as a Christian as well?
Well, at that time, in the 50s, this is, well, first of all, I was a cadet nurse in the Paddington Green Children's Hospital to begin with, in the mid-50s. At that time, I was quite religious, but I was not really a Christian, but didn't realise that. And there was a little group of Christians meeting together, Christian nurses, and they asked me to join them. and they called it a Scripture Union group. They must have prayed for me a great deal. We went to the Billy Graham Crusades, which was fantastic, and it was wonderful going on the London Underground with people singing right through the tube, singing the songs, Billy Graham songs from the Crusades, which was absolutely amazing. There was a Roman Catholic girl with me, training with me. Her uncle was a surgeon and he forbade her from going to the Crusades. And I don't think if he'd known, he would have liked her to come and join us in prayer and so on, Bible study in the little group. Eventually, after seeing a film, I beheld his glory about the Easter story. So it was about this time, 17th of March, 1954. It's about the only date I remember. And I was alone in my room, and the Lord just revealed himself to me. And I was completely changed and just longed to tell people about Jesus. Going forward, went on to do my general nursing in Hampstead, and the Lord provided a mentor for me. The beginning of my training, he taught me how to pray and how to read the Bible. And we were sharing rooms with other nurses at that time. We all had to sleep in. And we knelt by our bedside, so it was very public straight away. And then we were on the wards after that. Some of the sisters on the ward were not keen, especially one of them was against me, would never allow me. We had split shifts, would never allow me morning or evening time off to go to church. She gave me afternoons, but what she didn't know was a nurses' Christian fellowship group that we all went to when we were off, and we had Bible study and fellowship that way. The matron and assistant matron all were against us and used to blame us for anything that happened in the nurses' home that was wrong, even though we weren't in it, whatever it was. So we did have a fair bit of opposition there, but also it was a time of spiritual reaping as well, I think. I had an Indian boyfriend at that time.
Did you?
He didn't know the Lord, and I belonged to a group called One by One Band, I think it was called, and we prayed for those one by one to come to the Lord, and he came to the Lord, which was really marvellous. Then for a short time I went to Royal Southampton Hospital in Southampton, and the Anglican chaplain there were not keen on those who were not Anglican, so he wouldn't allow us to have communion. But the strange thing is, we were able to take prayers, as we called it, in the wards. But then, after that, I did my midwifery training in a completely different area in East London, in a wonderful hospital, the Mothers' Hospital, Salvation Army. All the sisters were Christians, officers in the army, and the matron was a colonel in the army. And when we delivered a baby, we used to say, would you like us to give thanks for the birth of the baby? Rarely did anybody refuse. And the matron churched, as they called it, churched the mothers before they were allowed out into the community. So she prayed with them so they could go out and among the people in the community. So, yeah, that was it was an interesting time and a lovely time in that really wonderful hospital. So that gives you some idea, anyway. Oh, yeah. I think I can't think of anything else, but that gives you a flavour, anyway.
No, thank you for sharing that. It's good to hear that even in hard times and times of illness, and in very difficult working environments where often in workplaces people aren't treated fairly and there is opposition, under opposition to the gospel, actually there are opportunities to pray and to love people and to share the gospel. And God actually works through those situations.
Oh, definitely. And I found in this time too that there have been opportunities on the phone to friends who don't know the Lord. My art friend who phones me once a week now, the time usually when we usually do art. And she revealed that she's got some kind of faith.
Right.
I don't think it's saving faith, but she's got some kind of faith, so it opens the door to share with her.
Yeah. You and your social life and all your art and clubs, I can't get over it so much. Well, Sally, thank you so much for joining. And yes, it's great to hear from you and to benefit from your encouragement. And I hope people at church will be encouraged by what you've said as well. So thank you.
Oh, I do hope so.
Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to say to everyone?
Be strong and of good courage. Keep on going. And pray and wash your hands.
Yes, that's the right answer. Thank you. And thank you, Sally, for that interview. Well, we're going to come on to Leviticus now, Colin.
Jolly good.
Yes. And you might be wondering, why the book of Leviticus?
No, I wasn't wondering why the book of Leviticus, because you told me you were going to do the book of Leviticus.
Yes, I suppose I did. And do you want to know why I'm so excited about the book of Leviticus?
Well, it's got, some people won't know, it's got the statement about loving one another as you love yourself, or love your neighbour as you love yourself. It's also got the Day of Atonement, which has great application for foresight, if you like, for what Jesus was going to do through his death on the cross. And then there's all sorts of other regulations that, when you start reading it from the first chapter, do get a bit repetitive.
Yes. And that's where we're going to start, really, with the idea that actually Leviticus is a book of animal sacrifices largely, and rules and regulations for how Israel is to live. And I think it's so relevant because it presents a situation where there is a problem in this community. There is a contagion. There is a contamination going on that is spreading. It is deadly, and it must be avoided through very inconvenient procedures, including social isolation for periods of time and elaborate protective equipment through specialists who know how to treat the problem, who prescribe solutions which must be followed no matter how inconvenient. So just take a look at this. This is Leviticus 1. I thought we'd just jump straight in. The burnt offering, Leviticus 1:1. The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. He said, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when anyone among you brings an offering to the Lord, bring as your offering an animal from either the herd or the flock. If the offering is a burnt offering from the herd, you are to offer a male without defect. You must present it at the entrance to the tent of meeting so that it will be acceptable to the Lord. You are to lay your hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted on your behalf to make atonement for you." Key word there, atonement. "You are to slaughter the young bull before the Lord, and then Aaron's sons, the priests, shall bring the blood, splash it against the sides of the altar at the entrance to the tent of meeting." And so we've got a situation where you have to bring animals to God and go through these priests who bring this blood, splash it in special places on altars, and you have to kill it and lay your hand on it. And it's one of those situations where you think, what is going on here? What have I stepped into? It's something between a cookbook and a sort of religious liturgy, isn't it? And we read that and think, why is this happening? And it's absolutely key that the first verse has the clue. Because the first verse says, the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. And if you remember when we looked at Exodus, the book ends after God has saved his people and delivered on his promises and brought them to himself. It ends with this tension where the people have hard hearts in the desert and they're grumbling against God and they commit idolatry with the golden calf. And yet God is dwelling with them. And the book of Exodus ends with the cloud and the glory of God dwelling in the tent of meeting and the tabernacle. this tent that God has ordered the construction of so he can live with his people. It's like God has moved in to be with them. Straight into Leviticus, God says, I'm in the tent of meeting, so now we have to do things in a very careful way. And there needs to be these animals. And we think, well, why would you have to do this? Because God has moved in. Isn't this an enormous faff? Is it completely unnecessary? And here's why we need to do it. This is jumping to Leviticus 10. Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, took their censers, put fire in them, and added incense, and they offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, contrary to his command. This is why it's good priests, bad priests, because some of the priests are good, but some of them, like these guys, no sooner have they been installed in their jobs than they do this. And what happens? Verse 2, fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Moses then said to Aaron, this is what the Lord spoke of when he said, among those who approach me, I will be proved holy in the sight of all people. I will be honored. Aaron remained silent. It's a shocking episode, and occasionally this happens in the Bible. People get too close to God, and when they come too close to God, actually, when people cross the line and do what he commands us not to do and disobey him, then God's holiness breaks out against them and they die. And it's a terrifying thing to have someone struck down and burnt up. And this is why the sacrifices are important. There's a real danger. I answered the door not too long ago to someone who was dropping something off for me while I had a little cough. And when I opened the door, the person was a few meters away, but she turned and she said, "Stay back!" I think she was quite alarmed that I'd actually come to the door. But there was an idea that, maybe I was contaminated with something. There was a danger. And in the same way, there's this great sense in Leviticus that there is danger because God is living with us. And the whole point of these sacrifices is that they need to happen. They need to happen because God is holy. He is too good to live with sinful people and just let it slide. And if you just have a look at these verses as well, just another couple of quick ones, we can see there are purpose statements in the book amid all the sacrifices and the rules. So there are rules for keeping clean and unclean. You must keep the Israelites separate from things that make them unclean, so they will not die in their uncleanness for defiling my dwelling place, which is among them, God says. And he says, do not profane my holy name, for I must be acknowledged as holy by the Israelites. I am the Lord who made you holy. God's name was revealed in Exodus when he saved his people, and he showed he is the incomparable God who is perfect and eternal and almighty. And when we disrespect his name, when we dishonor his name, that is incredibly serious. And if we're his people, as Israel were under the old covenant, we must be holy because God makes us holy. He is holy, and if he lives with us, we are to be holy like him. And yet we don't. And that's the problem. There's this grinding tension in the book that because Israel are people who have hard hearts and are sinful, they cannot live with God in safety. And perhaps you know what it feels like to do something wrong, to break a rule, to turn your back on God, or to let someone down, and to feel dirty and unclean and contaminated. That is exactly how the book of Leviticus is supposed to make us feel. It's supposed to say we are not mates with God, and we can't just turn up to his house whenever we feel like it. We can't just presume on his charity because he is holy, and we take an enormous liberty, and we must obey him. That's why there are so many rules, and some of those rules are given in ceremonial fashion and have ceremonial aspects to illustrate for us the issue of holiness, like the Levitical food laws, which Christians don't keep because Jesus declares food's clean. But that's there in the Old Testament to show us in miniature, as an illustration, what it is like, this idea of holiness, clean and unclean, and the separation that needs to happen from sin. And the sheer pollution that Leviticus puts before us, with sacrifice after sacrifice after sacrifice being needed, and more sophisticated measures being needed to protect people from the anger of God and the judgment of God. It shows us a perspective that we don't like to think of ourselves. We don't think of ourselves as particularly bad people, do we? We don't think of ourselves as particularly evil or troublesome. And yet John Courage says the book of Leviticus is indispensable for teaching the Christian the depth and the heinousness of human sinfulness. The chasm that separates a holy God from an unholy humanity stems from this pervasive iniquity. It's not a human perspective on humanity, it's God's perspective on humanity. And the book of Leviticus is to teach us, partly, how God sees us. And outside of Christ, he sees us as unclean, polluted, contaminated, unfit because of our sin, because of our wrong thoughts, our wrong words, our wrong deeds and our attitudes. And that contaminates us. And that sets us up beautifully for Easter, because we cannot understand Easter and we cannot understand the death of Jesus on Good Friday for us without Leviticus. It just doesn't make sense. Why would the Son of God have to die? Why would he have to be a sacrifice on a cross? The New Testament picks up the language of Leviticus and says Jesus is the sacrifice and he's also the priest. He's both of those things. And he makes people clean before God. And look at this. This is from the Day of Atonement. You mentioned this, Colin. There's a special day on Yom Kippur once a year where on this day atonement will be made for you to cleanse you. Then before the Lord you'll be clean from all your sins. And so there's a repeated pattern in the Levitical laws that you need to make atonement. I've highlighted it there. It comes up again and again. The priest makes atonement for the holy place. He cleans out the sacrifice facilities that get polluted with sin, like a deep clean. And then he makes atonement for the priests and all the members of the community through blood sacrifice, because a punishment must be paid and life must be taken, because the wages of sin is death. And this is a lasting ordinance for Israel. Atonement is to be made once a year, ongoing, because the problem of sin is ongoing. And these sacrifices don't solve the problem in the long term. They seem to be insufficient even. That's the right word, isn't it? Insufficient for the problem of taking away sins. And that's why we need Leviticus to understand what Jesus does on the cross. Because on the cross, Jesus lays down his life as a sacrifice that is once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, Peter will say, to bring you to God, to actually bring you so we can approach the throne of grace with confidence and dwell with God in his holy presence and be totally clean. It just gives a total different perspective, Colin, on Easter, doesn't it? And on how we think about ourselves and on the sacrifice of Jesus.
Yep, it does. And you mentioned earlier, didn't you, about it being the contagion of sin. In Leviticus, you do notice how an unclean person make others unclean in what could be quite an escalation. So as you've mentioned, some people have to be isolated, but one wonders, or I wonder sometimes, how on earth they manage to cope with all the different regulations, and also just how much of a sacrifice they need to make. Because you think of them wandering around a desert without any pasture or water, but given the amount of animals that they must have sacrificed, they must have had pasture and good livestock and breeding of animals just to cope with all of that. Yeah.
And they have to sacrifice the good ones as well, the healthy ones, the ones without blemish. You can't pass off scraggly goats and things. Leviticus is very specific about that. And so, there's an enormous cost. You have to give of your best to make atonement. And actually, that's an indication to the value of Jesus. It's actually the best, God's best, his Son, is given for us. And the only perfect man who ever lived, his life was so valuable, and yet he died for no fault of his own on the cross to be that sacrifice and to take away our sins. And that's an enormously costly, precious sacrifice, isn't that?
Yeah.
So I think there's something about Leviticus in terms of summarizing what it teaches us. It prepares us for Easter. It shows us there's a contagion that's more serious than coronavirus, that takes more faff to deal with, because Jesus says, don't be afraid of those who kill the body and can do no more. Death in and of itself is not the worst thing that can happen to you. Actually, we need to worry about the judgment of God and the problem of sin. And the sacrifice of Jesus is what makes sin taken away from us, doesn't it? He is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And so Leviticus helps us see we are spiritually dirtier than we can imagine. And I think that bit of the puzzle needs to be in place, doesn't it? Before we can understand Good Friday and before we can understand Easter, Colin.
Yeah. And I think the Day of Atonement, being one of the highlight chapters for myself, is striking in that there's two goats that are involved in that. One is sacrificed and killed to make atonement for the people, and the other one is taken off into a distant land after the priest has put his hands on it to take away the sin or the curse of sin way out into the wilderness, where it's set free and presumably never comes back, which is a lovely picture of two aspects of what Jesus is doing as we remember his death at Easter.
Yeah. So funnily enough, Leviticus is a happy book because it makes us very, very happy about Jesus and what he did for us on the cross.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're going to be having a special Good Friday broadcast this Good Friday to think more about the cross. But I hope that has just helped to set up how we are to think about Easter and why we have such a reason to celebrate it, that if we trust in Jesus, we can share in his sacrifice. So don't let one deadly contagion raging around the country distract you from the real deadly contagion that the Bible would have us think about, which is sin and our spiritual unholiness. And have a very joyful Easter week as we think about the amazing work that Jesus did for us. I think that's about all from us. So we all have to say, until the next time, stay close to Jesus and wash your hands. You've got to do the action.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
And also just to mention that there is a song playlist on Facebook of Easter songs. So if you want to begin to think about what's happening and what happened, I should say, and the effects of what Jesus has made upon us personally and upon the world, then do check out some of those songs, because their words will help you meditate on those things.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.